Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Pei Hey contains one Mishnah. Interestingly, although the Mishnah does not appear until 3/4 of the way through the Daf, most of the Daf is discussing that Mishnah. We'll have two machlokse amaroim, both of which are, although totally independent subjects, will both bring a proof from that self-same Mishnah. The Gemara will discuss each machlokes amaroim and the proofs on each side. Then the Gemara will actually quote the Mishnah, and then the Gemara will analyze, following the Mishnah, another statement in the latter part of that Mishnah. So first of all, let's discuss our first machlokes amaroim, and that is the sugya of shviras atzamos, the isser to break a bone on the korban Pesach, and the question is, which bones does that apply to? And the sugya is it limited to the bones that have meat on it or bones that don't have meat on it? The bones that have meat on it obviously have something edible about it, so you're eating part of it. The bones that have no meat, there's nothing to eat, you're allowed to break the bones. Now, the Torah had said, and that is coming right after where it said, and that teaches me that it's only something that has edible parts that there's an issur to break the bones. So there are 4 levels of meat on bone that is going to be discussed. There's a machlokes about only one of them. So the highest level, of course, is bone that has meat on it all over. It's definitely usher to break the bone. Good, everybody agrees about that. The next level is if there's no meat on the outside of the bone, but the bone is filled with marrow. The marrow is also edible. Now here, although there's no meat on the outside that you could eat, there is edible food, and as a matter of fact, there is edible food, and therefore the issur of breaking the bones should apply. But on the other hand, the mitzvah to eat the marrow should counteract the issur to break the bone, because you have to break the bone to get at the marrow. The Torah is not going to allow any other way of getting to the marrow. You can't burn your way through it and destroy some of it. So it's got to be, in order to be mekayim the mitzvah of eating that marrow, you're going to have to break the bone. So does that mean that I'm allowed to break this bone or not? So the Gemara says everybody agrees that this bone you cannot break. It's usher to break. The mitzvah does apply to it, the mitzvah of not breaking the bone, the issur to break the bone, and even though there's marrow there, it does not push it away. The Gemara quotes a brisa that gives a source for this. The brisa says that when the Torah tells us about Pesach Sheni, it says that the Pesach Sheni has to have all the halachos of a regular korban Pesach, which is brought by Rishon, and then it adds ve'etzem lo yishbru bo. You can't break a bone. Why do you have to repeat that you can't break a bone? You already told me it has all the halachos. The Gemara explains, the Brisa explains, this is to tell me that you cannot break the bone even to get at the marrow that's in it because you want to eat it. The issur of breaking the bone still applies. So again, what do we have so far? If the bone has meat on the outside, it's definitely usher to break it. If it has marrow on the inside, it's definitely usher to break it. The machlokes between Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish comes up about a bone that has meat on it, but not in the place you want to break it. It has meat, let's say, on one end, you want to break the other end. That's machlokes of Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rav Yochanan says there is an issur to break that bone, even though there's no marrow on it, and that's even though there's no meat on it, neither on the outside nor on the inside in the spot you want to break it. And Reish Lakish says no, you're only not allowed to break it where there's meat. In the different part of the bone, you're allowed to break it. Now, a bone that has no meat on it whatsoever in any place and no marrow within it, that Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish also agree you are allowed to break that bone. Now the Gemara is going to have 2 proofs. The first proof is from a brisa, which seems to say clearly that the issur of breaking bones applies both to bones that have meat and both to bones that do not have meat. Says Rav Yochanan. How are you going to understand this? We all agree that there's no issur to break a bone that has no meat. It must be referring to a bone that has meat, but not in the place you want to break it. And you see clearly that the issur does apply. Says Reish Lakish, no, it's not what it's talking about. It's talking about a bone that has no meat on the outside, but it has marrow on the inside. And it's teaching you that the issur applies even though the meat is only on the inside, not on the outside. And you may think that the mitzvah of getting to the marrow should push off the issur to break the bone. It does not. And the limud is brought again from the pasuk discussing Pesach Sheni. Okay, the Gemara's next proof is from our Mishnah coming up later in the Daf. The Mishnah says as follows: what if you have a limb of the korban Pesach, part of it went out of Yerushalayim, and therefore that part became puzzle and even tameh, and part of it stays within Yerushalayim. So what are you supposed to do with it? So our Mishnah as we shall see soon, the Mishnah says you cut at the spot, at the border between the part that went out and the part that stayed in. You cut through as much meat and everything else as you can until you get to the bone. Then you peel the mutter meat off the bone. And when you get to the joint, you cut through the joint and then you throw out the bone. So what you've done is if you've cut out the usser part, you've cut out the usser half without cutting the bone, you've taken out the entire bone, even the part of the bone which never left. You throw that whole thing out. And that way you have no isser at all. You didn't cut through the bone. So it says Reish Lakish says Rav Yochanan, if you're allowed to break a bone when there's no meat, why don't you just peel away an inch of meat and then break the bone? What's the problem? Obviously, the isser to break a bone applies even if there's no meat on it. The Gemara answers for Reish Lakish, no, even though you're allowed to break the bone in a place where you peel off the meat, still, there's a reason we don't want you to do that here. The Gemara gives two reasons. Abai says we're afraid if we allow you to break the bone, you'll whack it with a hakmesh, or you'll end up smashing it even in a place where there is meat. Ravina says we're talking about a bone that has marrow in it. Since it's filled with marrow, you're not allowed to break it because of the meat on the inside. You just have to peel the entire bone out and throw it away. Okay, now the Gemara introduces a different machlokes, and this machlokes will bring a proof from the same Mishnah, and we'll discuss several other proofs about this machlokes. So first, the Gemara gives a bit of background information. The halacha is that there are a number of things which pasel karbanos, that the Chachamim said if they're pasel, they're also metamei, the hands of the Kohanim who touch it. The reason that the Chachamim did that is to give a deterrent for the Kohanim of making this psul, either by accident or on purpose, because they wouldn't want to become tamei, and by making it mitamei, we avoided this situation happening. So there are two types of psulim that this applies to for sure. One is pigul, which means that the Kohen has in mind the wrong eating in the wrong time. That pasels the carbon. Chazal were also made it mitami the carbon so that the Kohen shouldn't make it pigul on purpose in order to get at the guy who was bringing it if he didn't like him. The other one is nicer. Nicer is where it's left over, and there the Chachamim were afraid that the Kohanim would be a little bit lazy and they wouldn't eat all the meat within the proper time, and therefore to encourage them from not being lazy, they made it metame. Now the Gemara says, what about yoytze? What about where the meat goes outside its proper zone? We know that karbanos have a certain zone they're supposed to be in. Kachim have to be within the Azara. Kalim have to be within Yerushalayim. Something which goes out is pasul. Does that have a psul of will that become tamei as well or not? Now the reason for the tumah is to encourage the Kohanim not to have this psul happen. The question is, do we have such a concern about something going outside of its proper zone? The Kohanim, at least, we're suspecting them of being lazy, so there is no laziness involved in taking it outside its proper zone. That you have to actually get up and bring it outside its proper zone. On the other hand, they may do it despite somebody. So the question is, does it apply to the psul of yotze or not? So the Gemara says that is a machlokes. Machlokes, if something which goes outside its proper zone and gets a psul of yotze, does that become tamei or not? Now, the Gemara just introduces one other machlokes here. The Gemara says when it becomes tamei, what is the size of the tumah? What is the minimum size to have this tumah on it? The Gemara says the machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Chizda, if it's a concise, size of an olive, or kabetza, the size of an egg. What's machlokes based on? The minimum size of tumas eichlin, tumah of foods, is usually an egg. On the other hand, the isser, one violates the isser of eating pigul or nicer, is a kazayis. So this is tumah based on isser. Did Chazal base it on the isser? Anything which is usser, any size which is usser is tamei, and therefore kazayis is a tamei, or did they just give it the general halachas of tumas eichlin, and therefore it needs to be a kabetza in order to be usser? That we need to know because that'll get involved in one of our rayas to the machlokes. So again, we're trying to figure out if a carbon which goes outside of its proper zone, if that becomes tamei or not. And the Gemara's first proof is going to come from the Mishnah, which we quoted just before. If you have a limb of a carbon Pesach which goes partially out, what do you do? So we said you cut through the meat and then you peel the mutter part off the bone and throw it out. The Gemara's question is, if it's tamei, if the part which went out is tamei, then in the place where the tamei touches the tar, it's metamei. The border, they are matami each other there. So what does it help that you cut it off? The mutter part is now tamei as well. So Gemara says, no, it's tumas beis hastarim. In a place that's two things that are supposed to be cut are touching is hidden. It's not considered visible. And the halacha is that in a place where tumah contacts tahara, but it's not visible, the tumah is not transferred. Someone asks, but Ravina says as far as food goes, it is transferred. It's considered cut and it is transferred. What are you going to say? The Gemara says, okay, we'll have to come on to a different answer, that the actual issue here was less than the minimum size. Either it was less than a kazayas or it was less than a kabeitza, depending who you hold like, but it was less than the minimum size, and that's why it didn't transfer tumah, in this case, the case of the Mishnah. Okay, that's all for the Mishnah. The Gemara now goes to a different brisa and brings a proof from there. This brisa discusses the halacha of somebody who takes his carbon pesach from one chabura to another chabura. We know that the halacha is you can't take your carbon pesach out of your house. Once it's in your house, you take it out of the house, that's yotze, and it's also to eat. Question is, what if you have two groups each eating their own carbon pesach in the same house? Are you allowed to take it from one chabura to the other chabura? So the Gemara proves that you're not allowed to do that. The Gemara later will give the source for that. Let's just learn it now. The source is from the pasuk describing it going out of the house. It says, min habayis min habasar chutza. You cannot take meat out of the house outside. What's the extra word outside? Can't even be outside of this chabura into a different chabura. So the Gemara quotes this brisa that says that if you take the meat from one chabura to another chabura, it's tahar. So Gemara wants to say tahar, but it's aser. As a matter of fact, the brisa itself says tahar and aser. So the Gemara wants to say, what does it mean tahar and aser? So the Gemara wants to say, obviously it's tahar from any tumah, and it's aser, you violated the iser. So first, the Gemara tries to get out of it, it's tahar, but there's no real iser. The Mishnah just says that there's a loisaseh. It doesn't say that there's an iser. The Gemara says, no, the brisa in the seifa, the end of it says, clearly you violated an iser. So how is it possible that there's an iser of yotze, but there's no tumah? Clear proof that even when something is yotze, tumah doesn't apply. So the Gemara says, well, maybe I could have told you that we're talking about where it is big enough to be usr, but not big enough to be tameh. So that way there's Isser and there's no Tumah. So the Gemara says that works according to the Man Yamru, who says that the Tumah only applies if it's the size of a Kebetza. So then they were referring to a piece of meat which is between the size of an olive and the size of an egg. It's big enough to be Aser like an olive. It's too small to be Tameh like an egg. But according to the one who says it's the same shear, they're both an olive size. You can't say that. So what are you going to answer? How are you going to explain this brisa? The Gemara answers, this situation is different. This is a carbon Pesach. And about a carbon Pesach, you're right. There is no tumah when it goes outside of its proper zone. And the reason is that the Chachamim were not afraid that people would make a mistake, because there's a whole chabur involved, and the whole chabur will take care to make sure not to make mistakes. B'nei chabura's reason, the Gemara says. They'll be careful to make sure that it doesn't go out. We don't have to make tumah in order to discourage mistakes from happening. My question is about other karbanos. Other karbanos which could be brought by individuals or very small amounts of people. Do you say that there's a psol if it goes out? Well, there is a psol. Do you say that there's tumah if it goes out of its proper zone or not? The Gemara leaves it as a teku. We do not have an explanation. Now the Gemara throws in another halacha over here about the psol of yotzei. You cannot carry it out from house to house or even from chabur to chabur, as we've said. The Gemara quotes Rami that says that in order to violate the iser, you have to do just like carrying on Shabbos. Carrying on Shabbos is called eitzah. This is called eitzah. You have to pick it up, do an akira, carry it to the wrong place, and put it down. Until you put it down, you haven't completed the hitzah, and therefore there's no iser. So there's a kasha on that from a brisa which says that if they were dragging a large cow carbon on poles or ropes, and the first group that went outside the wall of the azara is tameh, and the other ones that are still inside are not tameh. So the question is, but you haven't stopped yet. You're still dragging it. The proof is that you're on the way out. The ones that are in are moving out, and the ones that are out are already out. So how could it be matame anybody yet if it's still in motion? There's no hanacha. So the Gemara says, no, it's dragging. Dragging is different. Dragging is considered like it's stopped because it's lying on the ground itself. Okay, this ends the Gemara. Now we get to our next Mishnah. The Mishnah begins with the case of, again, the limb, which was partially outside Yerushalayim and partially in. And the Mishnah spells out, as we've seen, you cut through the meat, and then you peel off the kosher meat, off the bone, and you throw out the bone, and you throw out the bone and the meat, which was outside the zone, and you just eat the meat which stayed inside the entire time. Now, the Mishnah moves on to another halacha, and it defines what is the edge exactly. So there are three situations in which you could take something outside Yerushalayim. One is through a window in the wall, one is through a door in the wall, one of the gates, and another is over the top of the wall. Now, the walls that have a psul of Yetzei, there's a couple of different ones. There's the Yerushalayim, wall of Yerushalayim for Kachei Kalim, and there's the wall of the Azara for Kachei Kachim. So the Gemara says as follows: over the wall or windows, the thickness of the wall itself counts as inside. That's inside. It's only outside when it passes the edge of the thickness of the wall. As far as the door, it's a little more complicated. The thickness of the door, sometimes they were very thick. They could be a couple of feet thick. And there are the hinge is attached on the inside edge of the door, and the door swings forward into the doorway. It nestles into the thickness of the doorway, and there's a door jamb. There's a piece of wood that the door strikes against on the inside. It doesn't fill up the entire thickness of the doorway, but somewhere along the thickness of the doorway, there's a piece there that hits the door. So the Gemara says that piece, the door jamb that the door or the gate strikes, that's the edge. Further in from that is in. Further out from that is considered to be out. Now, what about the door jamb itself? That could be pretty thick. What about parallel to that? The Gemara will bring that up. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara quotes of Yehuda named Rav, who says the same halacha applies to tefillah. Somebody who's outside a shul is not mitzdarif, does not count towards the minyan of 10 people. And you define outside by the same way. If you're in the doorway within the jam, you're counted as in. If you're beyond it, then you're counted as out. Yeshua ben Levi says no, it doesn't matter if you're in or you're out, you're still mitzdarif to the minyan. There are no walls between Klal Yisrael and the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, the Gemara asks, what is the halacha about the door jam? The jam itself, does that count as inside, does that count as outside? We have a contradiction. Because we said that inner from it is in, and outer from it is out. So what is it itself? So the Gemara says it depends which door you're talking about. If you're talking about the gates of Yerushalayim, that counts as outside. If you're talking about the gates of the Azara, that counts as inside, except for Shar Nikanor, where it counts as outside. Now, the gates of Yerushalayim, the reason why it counts as outside is so that the Mitzrayim, people who have tzaras, who are sent outside the city, should have somewhere to rest, sheltered from the sun and the rain, so they'll rest in the door jam over there. Shar Nikanor, Mitzrayim also have to come in. And the reason for that is that they have to be able to stand as close to the Azara as possible and stick in their thumbs of the hand and the foot, because they have to have blood applied to it from their carbon. Now, they can't go into the Azara yet, because they're called Mechusar Kippurim at the time that the blood has to be applied. Mechusar Kippurim is not allowed to go into the Azara. On the other hand, the blood can't go out of the Azara, because that would passel the blood. So how are you going to put the blood, which can't leave the Azara, on the hand of somebody who can't go into the Azara? Solution is, he stands at the edge, and he sticks in his hand and his foot. Part of the body going in is not a problem. It's only the majority of the body that goes in that could be a problem. And then they apply the blood where it needs to be. Anyway, but they did that at Shar Nikanor, and that's why the door jam of Shar Nikanor was not Niskadish, did not have the halach of the Azara, so that they could stand in the door jam and be able to stick their thumbs.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.